U.S. President Joe Biden has led tributes to Colin Powell, who died at the age of 84. He was the child of Jamaican immigrants. Powell was the first African American to become Secretary of State. While he will be remembered for his military and political service, his credentials as a leader have left a profound impact on the business world as well. Now, he served on the boards of Salesforce and Bloom Energy, and in 2012, he listed his 13 rules of leadership. So listen up. Rule number 1. It ain't as bad as you think, not ever. Rule number 4, it can be done. Rule 7, you can't make someone else's choices. Rule 10, this is important, right? Especially now. Remain calm and be kind. And finally, Rule 13, perpetual optimism is a force multiplier. Lieutenant General Mark Hertling served under Colin Powell, and he joins me now from Florida. And first and foremost, condolences to you and the larger military community, because I know how much he meant to that community. There are tributes pouring in from everywhere now. How does that inform us in terms of what his legacy will be, and how transformative was his leadership?
Well, Paula, first I have to smile because of your recitation of some of the 13 rules that were published in his book, and he explains how those rules came about. There were just snippets of paper underneath his desk, and one of his secretaries told a reporter that she ought to ask about those rules. So he listed them out, and they suddenly became famous as his 13 rules. But there are much more. There are so many more things about General Powell that those of us who knew him will relate. Everyone has a story. I've been seeing stories all day on the internet from friends, from emails that I've received. This guy was a titan. He lifted the services up. He rebuilt. He was one of the few general officers who lived through Vietnam and then decided as a cabal that they would reframe the American Army into a much better force after they had seen the disaster of Vietnam. So these were the individuals that literally bridged a generation. And all of the younger guys, I was a major when General Powell was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, watched him, listened to him, closely observed the kinds of things he was doing, and it just made so much of a difference in all of our lives. And those rules of leadership are just one of myriad examples of things that he did for us.
Yeah, and I'm sure so much of that was, again, as you said, framed really from Vietnam and that difficult service that he pretty much started his military career with. Now, his tenure as both in the military and Secretary of State, as you know, was at times contentious, especially the insistence that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. And yet, do you think that so-called Powell doctrine, right? Go in with overwhelming military force, have an exit plan, did it endure? And I have to say again, we didn't see it endure just now in Afghanistan.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm smiling because I just had a conversation with a colleague about that some, like me, would say that the Powell Doctrine is something that's actually diffused from Clausewitz, one of the great military theorists of the last 300 years. There are others that say, hey, that's damaging to the military because sometimes it's not politically feasible to do the things that Powell asked to do. But really, it's steeped in theory. You have a tremendous military force, which is what Clausewitz said. You have the support of the people, which was what Clausewitz says, and you have the backing of the government. When you have those three things, a military force is given much greater chance of success. And as we've seen in some recent wars, we've been missing one or two of those things as we've attempted to conduct operations all over the world. But truthfully, one of the biggest things that General Powell was he was a peacekeeper. We all see him as a soldier, but he really abhorred war. So he was telling the political masters that once you make the decision to go to war, you better have overwhelming force and the support of the people as well as the backing of the government. And I'd add to all those things, a clear exit strategy, knowing when the war is over, when you've achieved your objectives so you can get out very quickly. I truthfully believe that the Powell Doctrine is actually very good and should be applied in most cases where the United States decides to send her young men and women into combat.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that you made that reference to him being a diplomat first and foremost. He always said, look, the military option should be the last option when you've exhausted everything else. What kind of a mark do you think that will leave on the military? I don't have to remind you the kind of turmoil that it's in at times.
Well, truthfully, Paul, it's fascinating because what you ask, I was in the Pentagon after 9/11, and I saw military leaders try and make those arguments to the civilian policy masters of how does this end? What does success equal? How do we see getting out of these kind of conflicts? And truthfully, there were many times when those questions weren't answered. Those are the demands of a military leader who, in a democratic society, that's dealing with his or her civilian masters to try and help them make the right decisions. And then you have to force those issues sometimes. And it gets to one of Powell's 13. Don't take counsel of your fears or the naysayers. When folks are telling you, oh no, you just have to do it, you better continue to press hard as a military leader until you get to the point where you can no longer press, and then you have to salute and conduct the mission as you see fit. But those are some important lessons to be learned, and we're certainly seeing them now after the end of the Afghanistan war on how things could have been done much differently.
Well, thanks so much for helping us really discern what his legacy is and really pay tribute to his life. Appreciate your time.